This is The Critical Thinker, Episode 3. Hi everyone, welcome to the show. I'm Kevin, your host, and this is The Critical Thinker Podcast, the show dedicated to helping you master the art and science of reasoning well. We've been talking about why critical thinking matters, why it's important to develop critical thinking skills. Last episode, I talked about critical thinking in terms of self-defense, as a means of protecting ourselves from the false rhetoric and bad arguments that are often used by people and institutions to get us to believe and do things that aren't really in our best interest. This is the situation when tools of persuasion are directed at us, when we're on the receiving end of an argument from a friend or an advertising pitch or a sermon or a political speech or a newspaper editorial or whatever. And we have to distinguish between good reasons to believe something and bad reasons to believe something. This episode, I want to talk about the flip side of the situation. When you're the one doing the persuading, you're the one in the position of having to give the argument or write the pitch or deliver the sermon or write the editorial. Now, what I want to claim is simple. If someone is well versed in the elements of critical thinking, then they're more likely to be effective persuaders in situations like these. This is what I mean by empowerment. We're empowered by our ability to organize our thoughts in a logical way and to craft an argument that gives our audience the strongest reasons possible to accept our conclusion. But as critical thinkers, we're also going to be empowered by our understanding of human psychology and the psychology of influence and persuasion. So when we give this argument, we're in a position to maximize its chances of being heard and acknowledged and responded to. Now, not everyone associates critical thinking with these kinds of positive qualities, and especially this last bit about the psychology of persuasion. Or at least it's not the first thing that comes to mind when they think of critical thinking. There are a couple reasons for this. One reason is that more often people associate critical thinking with the self-defense aspects that we talked about last episode. Another reason, and one that I think is more interesting to talk about, is a view that many people have that critical thinking is, and should be, about good logic and good argumentation, and that's it. They associate the psychology of belief and persuasion with the techniques of manipulative rhetoric that we're warning people against. So from this point of view, logic and argumentation is like white magic. It's what the good guys use. And rhetorical techniques and psychological strategies is black magic or dark magic. It's what the bad guys use. These are the tools used by advertisers and politicians and spin doctors to manipulate information and control public opinion. Now, I understand this point of view, and I agree that it's important to clearly distinguish a good argumentation from persuasive rhetoric. They're not the same thing. However, I think it's a mistake to think that the theory and techniques of persuasive rhetoric don't have a proper place in the critical thinker's toolkit. They do. They're just like any tool. They can be used for good ends or for bad ends. What ends you use them for is up to you. The tools themselves aren't to blame for the evil uses to which they're put. But the other point I want to make is that this psychological dimension is unavoidable. Every argument you give in the real world to a real audience is defined in part by the social and psychological context within which the argument is given. And in that context, the persuasive power of the argument is determined by an array of factors. The logic matters, but the logic needs to reflect the argumentative context of what's at issue, who you're trying to persuade, what they bring to the table in terms of background beliefs and values, why they care about the issue, what's at stake in the argument, and so on. And these are all psychological and social factors. If you don't understand these factors, if you can't get inside the head of your intended audience, if you can't see the issue through their eyes and tap into what they care about, what motivates them, then you'll never be able to persuade them to accept your point of view. Good argumentation isn't just about good logic. It's also about good psychology. Now, just to make the point a different way, think about what goes into crafting a great argumentative essay and delivering it as a speech. We outline the argument in a kind of shorthand. We focus on the key premises, identifying background assumptions that might be contentious, anticipate possible objections, come up with replies to those objections until we've got the logical structure of what we want to say laid out. But then we've got to think about how we want to present this. We've got to make choices about wording, about the order of presentation, about pacing, about vocabulary, about sentence and paragraph structure, and so on. And then we got to think about delivery. This is a speech after all, and we got to think about speaking technique and all those factors that go into good public speaking. And all the while, we're motivated by the goal of making this the most effective and persuasive argument we can. Now, when you think about this context, it seems a mistake to think about this thought process in terms of white magic and black magic, right? Thinking about rhetorical technique and the psychology of persuasion is an inseparable part of the crafting of a great persuasive argument. So, my view is that a good training in critical thinking needs to pay attention not only to logic and argumentation in the abstract, but also to logic and argumentation in real-world contexts, where rhetorical choices and psychological factors inevitably come into play when we are engaged in argumentation with real people. So it follows, then, that if you're well-versed in all these aspects of critical thinking, then you're going to be in a better position to have your voice heard, to be effective in the role of influencer. And that's why, as I continue to add tutorial courses to my critical thinking website, criticalthinkingtutorials.com, I'm going to be including courses on the psychology of belief and persuasion, not just so we can learn to defend ourselves against the dark arts, but also to use this knowledge and these tools to empower ourselves as influencers and persuaders. That's it for this show. Next show, I want to talk about the role of critical thinking in the social sphere as a matter of civic duty, so stay tuned for that. I want to remind listeners that this show is affiliated with the website criticalthinkingtutorials.com, where you can find over 80 video tutorials on logic and critical thinking. And if you're interested in getting access to all of the tutorials, you can subscribe to the site for a low annual fee, so you're invited to check that out. Thanks for listening and see you next time.